Well, thank you so much, Miriam, for supporting this workshop. And thank you all so much for coming out to learn about this information. We want to just kind of start the conversation and be able to share good information in the community. So my name is Lynn Fang. I'm a community soil scientist. I have a small business, Soilwise. We do ecological landscaping and also soil consulting, and I've been helping a lot of people with kind of contaminant testing and just trying to understand what's happening on their properties recently. And fortunate to be joined by James Oliver, so I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, thanks everybody for coming today. I'm James. I'm a community mycologist and soil scientist. Recently I'm working with CARE, the Center for Applied Ecological Remediation, which is a new organization that was founded previous to the fires to respond to the crisis of soil pollution and water, et cetera. This organization is founded by Dr. Danielle Stevenson, who's done work here in Southern California on native plant and native microbes and fungi, working with brownfields and et cetera. So we're working to try to provide resources and infrastructure and training, ultimately, on doing work around bioremediation. Yeah, and I guess before we get into the talk, I guess just like a note about format. We'll be going through for 45 minutes to an hour about some of the research that we've done that we want to share. And then after, we'll have time for questions. But if you have to leave at any point, or you don't have a question, or you can't get your question in, there's a follow-up form. So if you want to stay in touch, or if you just want to ask a question, these processes are, really driven by the questions themselves. There are no straightforward answers in bioremediation. It's very contextual. So questions are really important. So please, follow up with us if you've got a lead or you can't answer, or we don't have time.
Yeah, so if you got a handout on the back page, there's a QR code at the bottom, and that goes to a Google form. So you can submit your questions there, and if you're interested in volunteering or collaborating on projects, we can just take your information there and keep that in mind for upcoming projects. And we don't really have like a super beautiful handout, but we just put all the information we were going to talk about in here. So it's just like an outline. And as we collect questions, we can update this resource doc, and we'll try to send out maybe a more comprehensive resource doc after this event. So we're going to just start by talking about some experiences from previous urban fires. So like the Lahaina fire or the Camp Fire. There's also fires from Sonoma and Colorado. So honestly, there's not like, I didn't find like a ton of research on urban wildfire, like ash and soil. So this is just like what I was able to gather, and most of it kind of focuses on heavy metals, but there are also other types of contaminants as well. And so in Lahaina, they have this posted on like the Department of Health in Hawaii, and the ash characterization showed really alarmingly elevated heavy metals. Like the arsenic should really only be like maybe 1 part per million, and it's like 200 or 300. And the lead should only be like 80 parts per million. That's like a safety threshold. And it's also like 200, 300, 400, something like that. There was another kind of test or project in Colorado, the Marshall Fire, where they looked at the soil accumulation of the contaminants from ash. And they kind of saw that it wasn't so elevated in heavy metals, so the soil didn't necessarily like accumulate like all of the toxins from the ash. And they also did acknowledge in the Caltech webinar that those homes were more new, so they had like less toxic materials in those homes. And there's other research that shows the contaminants that come from the fire are like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which come from the burning of crude oil and gasoline, but also like wood and trash, volatile organic compounds, and there's also the release of asbestos from buildings, and as well as PFAS. They use that in firefighting foams. It's used in Teflon. It's in carpets. It's like everywhere. And one of the things that I think is interesting to point out is like in this one on E, it's about like the Butte fire and the Sonoma fire, that the total major and trace metal contents, like soil is like the least, and then followed by burned vegetation, followed by structure fires, and then vehicles. So vehicles are the highest kind of level of heavy metal contamination in terms of the ash that comes out of there. Do you want to add some more things?
Sure. I've had a little bit of experience working with Co-Renewal, who's item G, and so they've worked a lot in post-fire remediation up in Northern California. A lot of their work has been around creating straw wattles to place around homes burning down. And like Lynn is saying, there's like a lot of toxicity, dioxins, heavy metals, things like that coming from, depending on how old the building is, if you're looking at like lead paint, et cetera. But the idea kind of was that they would capture in the wattles all of the sort of runoff before they would get into streams and stuff like that, and also lining waterways. And then eventually after that, looking into how, once you've captured the contaminants, then taking a look at how, what's the next step is much easier in terms of how are we going to remediate this if you've got it captured, rather than trying to remediate it on site before anything happens. So there's a lot of slow thinking and slow processes to bioremediation, which can be really frustrating, right? Because we want to react and act very quickly, but it's a very sensitive process and a very dangerous process in terms of what we're working with.
Co-Renewal is a really cool organization to check out. They did just send me some straw wattle kits, so I have like some of these materials here. And if you don't know what straw wattles are, there's just like, you take like a mesh sock essentially, so there's this like mesh tube, and you stuff it full of straw. And there's different ways, and just regular straw wattles can help activate organic matter and microbiology. But they experimented with inoculating with native fungi and native soil, as well as compost tea. And these all help to bring in good microbiology that will help break down contaminants, as well as kind of accumulate heavy metals and contaminants so that they don't kind of persist in the water and the soil system. And you use like stakes to kind of like stake them in. So they sent me some of these stakes as well. And they gave me a cute card here, so you can check them out. There's also a really interesting study. I went to a talk by somebody who just retired from CalRecycle, Bob Horowitz. But when he was in CalRecycle, he worked with some different universities, CSU Chico, the University of Nevada, Reno, and they worked on comparing compost filter socks with uninoculated straw wattles, so just regular straw wattles, in terms of being able to filter out contaminants from runoff water after the campfire. And compost filter socks have been known to be able to filter runoff water. And so compost has organic matter complexes, microbiology, and so it can sequester heavy metals, it can hold on to heavy metals, it can also help decompose some of these other contaminants as well. And so they found, they tested heavy metals, PFAS, and dioxins, and they found that the compost filter socks really accumulated much higher levels of these contaminants than the regular straw wattles. So you may have seen, and he said he was one of the people who put it into the contract because CalRecycle works with contractors to lay out compost filter socks or like to do kind of disaster cleanup and things like that. So he put it into the contract for CalRecycle and their contractor partnerships to lay out compost filter stocks around disaster areas. And so you may have seen they're working with like Conservation Corps and LA Sanitation to put out these compost filter stocks along kind of outside of like street gutters and where water's flowing down along the road edge. So all of that is helping to clean out contaminants that are going into our water system. And so, yeah, you don't want to touch them because they're filled with contaminants at this point. They would have to be replaced in order to, be more clean. But yeah, that was a really interesting study as well.
Yeah, also just to make a point on wattles, you can, so Lynn got these kits from Co-Renewal, but you can also purchase wattles. I mean, if you're wondering still what a wattle looked like, it's what construction crews will put around like piles of dirt. It's straw, it's like a tube. Anyways, you can get these at Home Depot. Some people might have issues with those. They're like sometimes like encased in plastic, and some people are concerned about like perhaps like what they treat the straw with itself to prevent it from like rotting. There's a lot of hard choices to make, and ultimately like harm reduction should be like kind of the ethical operating decision maker. But if that's not an option or not accessible to you, you can also take gunny sacks or burlap sacks. If you know a coffee distributor or some kind of industry that has that, if you can upcycle those, all you have to do is sort of stitch those together. It's very easy. You just make a very simple whip stitch. And you can make your own wattle, and then you can fill it with straw, you can fill it with compost, you can fill it with biochar, you can fill it with all sorts of different things that maybe you're interested in working with or playing with. Just wanted to make a point about that.
Yeah, so I unrolled one of these, and it's tied up at the end here. So that's kind of like your endpoint, and it's open over here. So that's where you would fill it with your substrate, essentially. So there could be straw or could be compost, could be a mix of different things. We'll talk a little bit more later about all the different kind of bioremediation strategies that are available. But that was like some of the research I had found, and there's also a great webinar that was put out by Caltech about some of the testing that they've done. And one thing I want to mention about dioxins, like it comes from like the burning of waste and plastics like PVC, and all of these contaminants are known to, if you have chronic exposure to them, cause chronic health conditions, endocrine disruption, neurological disruption, cancer. So this is like one of the largest structure fires that we've had. So potentially there's a lot more contaminants released from that. So that's where like we don't really know, like I don't know if there's like really good testing results that have come out. There's like some initial test results have come out. So that's what we have to work with at the moment. And so I've listed one more thing I wanted to mention in F is the LA Times said that the Fed's Army Corps is not going to test soil after their standard procedure of removing the debris and then removing the top 6 inches of soil. They're just going to assume that, doing that means the soil is clean. So in the past, and it might be just because this is an expensive cleanup, but in the past, it's been standard procedure to do like confirmation testing after removing those top 6 inches of soil to make sure there's really, the contaminant levels are not beyond the safety concern. So they're not planning to do that, and this article was saying that a third of the properties that were burned in the campfire had remaining contaminants in the soil after the top 6 inches was removed. So it's still important to test for those contaminants, and a lot of those people had to come in and remove more soil, not just once, but several times. So it's hard to say if that, just top 6 inches is enough. So that's why it's like important to do testing to understand. And every fire, every location, every situation is different. So we don't know exactly like the severity, without that testing. Did you want to say something?
Oh no, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah. Unless you want to talk about, you want me to talk about the contaminants.
Oh yeah, you can talk about.
Sure. Yeah, so the next section is just a brief overview of contaminants. In general, we're going to have elemental contaminants, which are things like heavy metals, things that like the periodic table that you might remember from the last time you took chemistry. Then we have like organic contaminants, which kind of means that like at some point these contaminants came from like a living organism or are derived from a living organism. So we're looking at oil, diesel, et cetera, et cetera. Inorganic contaminants, which is kind of the opposite of that. And then there's some other breakdowns like dioxins and PFAs and whatnot. But the first section, just as you can imagine, human domiciles are full of a lot of different things, like a lot of electronics, a lot of things that are baked into our houses that we're not exposed to, and therefore it's like safe in that regard. But right when it burns down, we're exposed to a lot of this. So already mentioned like lead is one thing, and if we're just looking at heavy metals, lead is one thing that can be present through paint, and lots of common household items actually have lead in it, but it's considered safe. Arsenic is another thing that's prevalent. Cobalt, a lot of like rare earth minerals, et cetera, et cetera. And just to note about heavy metals in general is that heavy metals are more or less like they can't be destroyed unless you're like talking about like how like suns and stars and stuff form like that. They pretty much stay the same on planet Earth. So working with heavy metals is either finding a way to extract them from an environment or finding a way to sort of bind them or combine them with another element that maybe makes it less toxic to us. So just a highlight about that, but I'll let Lynn talk about the next section.
There's also lithium in our electronic vehicle batteries, so that's of concern as well. And I mentioned the PAHs. Yeah, these occur naturally in coal, crude oil, gasoline, and they accumulate when they're released from the burning of coal, crude oil, and gasoline, as well as wood, and they also occur from burning cigarettes and trash. And we have volatile organic compounds. These are also released by natural ecosystems, but they also come from home cleaning products, building products, industrial paints and adhesives, fossil fuel combustion, vehicle emissions, solvents, and paint. So there's a lot of sources where they could be coming from. That could be in our homes and communities. Asbestos was used as an insulation material pre 1970s. And I think the federal government, by the 1950s, they were starting to understand this connection between asbestos and cancer. There's cancer called mesothelioma. It's a cancer of your lung lining. And so people with asbestos exposure were developing this cancer. And that's because asbestos is like a tiny fiber. It's a natural mineral. And when you breathe it in, it stays in your lungs, and it's really hard for it to come out. And that's where it causes chronic, problems. And so they put a moratorium on using asbestos, but people were still using it. And so there's a lot of historic homes in Altadena that probably use this material. And it doesn't decompose in the soil. So when it's, the times when it's a hazard is when you're installing it, when these fibers are gonna be in the air, basically. So when you're installing it or taking down a building or, so in this case, if there's asbestos accumulation in the soil, it would be if you're digging into the soil, you could potentially have that exposure to asbestos. And from the brief research that I did, it doesn't decompose, and there are some microbes that could help detoxify it and make it less toxic. And it was mostly certain types of lichens and fungi that could do that. And plants could potentially stabilize asbestos in their root zone, and they're not going to take it up. So it's if you don't dig into the soil and kind of lift that material out, then you won't really get exposed to it. So anyway, that's kind of the properties of asbestos. And then PFAS I mentioned, which stands for poly and perfluoroalkyl substances. And that's used everywhere for water and grease-proof properties. It's in your coffee cups, to-go containers. Firefighting foam, which I my understanding is that they only use firefighting foam up in the mountains. So that's like maybe a little bit further away from the structures, although I'm not sure, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And so the potential for that contamination would be just like drift from air or water. And so anyway, just to put that on your radar. And it's also in carpets, upholstery, insulation, roofing, it's in Gore-Tex, electronics, automotive, aerospace industries. So it's people call it a forever chemical because it really doesn't break down in general, and it's highly mobile through all systems. It moves through water, moves through animals and plants and soil. And there is some research, like there's maybe some fungi that could break down PFAS. And so I saw an article recently about activated charcoal or carbon that's like heated to high heat that could potentially break down PFAS, but I don't know if it's like an extracted PFAS, like just isolated PFAS, or if it's in a substrate. I'm not sure about that detail. And then dioxins and furans, they come from waste incineration and metal processing, combustion of plastics, PVC plastics, treated wood, chlorine-containing materials, coal, wood. They're on coated paper, and they also are very difficult to break down, so they accumulate in our food, and they're pretty persistent in our environment. So that's where these like fires are going to release like a lot more dioxins. And we think about our irrigation systems, like so many people are using PVC in our landscapes. So that's also a big source of dioxins. You want to talk about the testing?
Yeah. So, going through all these contaminants, you're wondering like how do we work with trying to figure out what's going on. So Lynn's put together a list of some testing resources that we have here. Wallace Labs, Waypoint, Sunstar, Jones Lab. The point here is, and we'll get to this more in like sort of the ethics of bioremediation, and what's really important is testing is extremely important. And just to make a larger note here is it's also expensive. So, this is where forming maybe coalitions with people and maybe trying to get aggregate testing, meaning like testing together in large groups with laboratories, maybe try to talk to some of these labs. I know that Wallace Labs in the past has done free sampling in response to disasters or work that's been that's been around remediation or contaminated sites that aren't necessarily like, engineering firms. And then, sort of in the long term, I think like, Lynn and I and other people concerned about this, we're trying to build community infrastructure, accessible infrastructure to have access to this testing. It's very expensive, sometimes it's about $100, that's kind of like the low floor for heavy metal testing just for one sample. And so even doing that twice a year can be quite inaccessible to some people. So just really want to stress the importance going forward to, there's a lot of needs out there, and none of them should be competing with each other. I just want to put that out there, but we should really be trying to put resources together to, have organizations that can purchase this equipment and then do, either free, sliding scale donation, et cetera, to test these kinds of things. Because if we can make it accessible, we can really do some great work, and we can really protect our communities. The knowledge of what's in our soil is really, really, really important. And then the next section is safety thresholds, which this will kind of give you an overview of, what are, you get the results. Interpreting results is a whole nother section, whole nother part of this. You can do some research. It can be quite difficult to understand, but there are some straightforward resources in terms of heavy metal contaminants. So some of these will list, what's considered not safe or residential, commercial, industrial, or what makes something qualify out as almost a Superfund site. Is there anything you else want to say about that?
Yeah, and I guess one thing I will say is that these can be kind of difficult to read. These are like giant tables with like bazillions of chemicals and different types of thresholds for different like things like cancer versus non-cancer versus like hazardous waste cleanup versus like just residential exposure. So it's a lot of like information to sort through. So that's something where it would be great to, I don't know, try to make it more accessible, create tools to help people understand how to utilize these tables. And so there are some different testing initiatives that are out there right now. I linked the Caltech webinar, which is pretty good. They have done some internal testing of like, there's like ash, and then there's like fines, they call it, like fine particles or soot or dust. And something they found was like heavy metals is higher in the soot than the ash than the soil. So anyway, something to keep in mind if you're dealing with soot like in an indoor space, that it potentially could have higher like levels of heavy metals than the ash. Also was interesting, they showed the wind map. So the winds really blew south into the ocean. And so one thing is that so far I only have results from heavy metals testing, and I've tested like ash from a burned down home in Pasadena, which didn't have the same alarmingly high levels that the Lahaina ash showed. And I don't know, could almost be considered just like normal levels of contamination in LA. And tested like soil from in and around like the Eaton Fire area, and they typically haven't been like that same kind of 200, 300, 400 parts per million. So one thing, I've been talking to an environmental engineer and like Danielle Stevenson as well, and potentially like that doesn't mean, and I don't know, that just means like potentially those contaminants like blew somewhere else, so it could be further south or in the ocean. Like most of my efforts right now have been kind of focused in and around the burn areas, so I haven't like ventured further out, so I don't know like what that contaminant level is like or how far it's spread. There are some university efforts. Caltech has one where they're willing to come out and sample air and soil in people's homes. And there's also a UC Davis initiative where people can send in their ash and soil samples, and they'll do that contaminant testing. And some of the tests will come back quickly, like the heavy metals could be fast. The pHs and VOCs could be probably relatively fast. Some of the other ones, like PFAS and dioxins, could take a lot longer with the university labs. But it's also nice to support their research efforts, and hopefully they can have a broader reach and develop like a more distributed map of those testing results. And so, yeah, I mentioned like some of the local residential community testing, and so yeah, we only have the heavy metals results. There's an example of the test results. I just picked like a few of them to showcase. And Wallace Labs, their standard test is plant available metals. So the total metal concentration is about 5 times that high. So I put in both the plant available that was tested and then the ×5 total soil. And then we also have started to just do the total soil analysis, because that's really what we want to look for, is the total soil metals. And I did put in like the California Department of Toxic Substances Control threshold safety levels, as well as EPA regional screening levels for the metals there. And then Wallace Labs also provides this table of California average soils. So arsenic is like naturally elevated in our area because of the geology of this area. So that average for them is like 3.5, whereas the California DTSC is like 0.11 parts per million. That's like their safety threshold. So they're saying if you go above that, you risk potential chronic illness if you have chronic exposure to that. So you can take a look at that. Most of the samples I looked at were highest 1 to 2 parts per million arsenic. So it's not the same levels as the Lahaina ash. And then the highest lead that I saw was a front yard in North Pasadena. And so that was 127 parts per million. So that's over the 80 parts per million threshold. So that's like relatively high, but also still not like 400 parts per million. So you can take a look at those. And I also work for LA Compost, and we also did some heavy metals testing at our compost site in Griffith Park. So I included the compost sample from Griffith Park, and also is like not, you know, insanely high like levels of lead. So like there's some lead in there, but it's not like so contaminated. And we did contract with the environmental engineering company to do additional testing at our sites like in Northeast LA and San Gabriel Valley. So hopefully we'll be getting those results in the next week or two. And I have been sending out samples for additional contaminant testing for PAHs, VOCs, asbestos, PFAS, dioxins. So the first batch will probably be coming this week, and then more results will be coming like in the next couple weeks. So we're still in the process of finding out. And it's also going to be a process just to interpret what these results mean. Yeah.
So before we get into an overview of bioremediation, we just want to compare it to conventional remediation, so a lot of what's perhaps going on right now. The pretty much classic method of conventional remediation is dig and dump. So like we mentioned earlier, removing soil, removing debris, and then, you know, especially with soil where you're removing several inches, digging that up, and then hauling that ultimately to somewhere else, which is extremely dangerous, it's extremely carbon intense, but more so it's very dangerous. Digging up the soil is agitating it even more, right? And then transporting it, right? If we're, most of the time, these are being transported to like, you know, some of the, like Utah or Colorado, Wyoming, especially like right next to native reservations and lands and things like that, basically. And if you think about one, not only how long it takes to get there, right, and all the, you know, think about just like one truck accident and spilling tons of, you know, what's considered toxic substance all over the road, into the air, into waterways, you know, even just little bits coming off of a truck. So there's a huge range of ways that people can be exposed to heavy metals and how these are being dumped somewhere else. And it's also the point that, right, when we're removing soil in these conventional remediation strategies, they're oftentimes bringing back soil and replacing those however many inches they've lost. And kind of like to think about it, somebody said, like, essentially what we're doing is we're taking our, you know, dirty soil, toxic soil from somewhere, dumping it somewhere where people can't defend their soil, and then stealing their soil, you know, in a place where they don't have the resources to defend their soil, and then bringing it back here or wherever. This is a strategy all over the U.S. So, yeah, and not to mention, again, like this is also an extremely, extremely expensive process. It's a bit of a fueled. There are a lot of for-profit companies that are cycled through this, and that they are set up to make a buck off of this. And you know, that's not to say like there are a lot of resources need to be devoted to cleanup, and I'm not suggesting otherwise. But we're also looking at perhaps like an ugly edge of like disaster capitalism and how they are, yeah, turning a dollar off of you know, suffering. You know, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, and that's just kind of, we just wanted to like bring the point of like, you know, thinking about, you know, we sort of not in our backyard sort of mentalities, and in terms of like, you know, there are appropriate places to put these, right? There are smart decisions of where to put these toxic sites and not to, but also like I've seen some dialogue online, at least, that's like, you know, wanting to remove soil from certain sites or debris from certain sites and put them in other sites in LA that are obviously much more marginalized and have a lot less resources. So again, just we really need to think about that. There's a needle to thread here. It's a very complicated discussion, but just to keep that in mind, because it is very complex.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of toxicity everywhere. So I think it's good just to practice like learning how to clean up toxicity like wherever we are and not just kind of putting it on a different community like somebody else and just like out of sight, out of mind. And so that's why we want to be encouraging bioremediation. And there's some like education and awareness involved with bioremediation in terms of developing like a good strategy. And a lot of things are helpful. So like compost, microbes, biochar, fungi, plants, they are all helpful. They all like contribute something to bioremediation. But we don't want to think about like either we don't want to isolate one of them and say we only need this and it's a panacea and that's all we need, because that's not necessarily true. And again, it's like important to do testing so we know like what's in there, like, and be able to develop our strategy based on what's in there. It's like if there's not a ton of heavy metals, like if that's not the issue, then like we don't need to try to like use plants to pull out heavy metals. Like maybe they can have a different purpose, like stabilizing the soil or something like that. So I think it's important to think about these different tools based on the ecological principles. And that's generally how I like to teach things anyway, is just understanding the ecological principles and then building our design and management processes like based on that. So that we understand how our tools and parts work and we can put them together in customized ways for the specific need, the specific site at hand. So I'll talk a little bit about what these different things do and the research on them. So like compost is like filled, like microbially active compost can do a lot of things, and there's a lot of interesting research. They composted like TNT contaminated soil and they found like a 99% reduction in TNT afterwards. There's research on compost being able to degrade PAHs and VOCs. It's not 100%, and there's different types of PAHs. There's like lightweight, low molecular weight ones, and there's higher weight, like high molecular weight ones. And so the low molecular weight PAHs are easier to degrade in compost. So the various studies I've seen is like maybe 50 to 80% degradation of PAHs, and that could be through composting contaminated soil or applying mature compost onto contaminated soil. And it's pretty similar, that degradation rate. So that would be a start in terms of degrading PAHs, and it's similar for VOCs as well. And there is some research about compost being able to degrade dioxins. PFAS would need like something more specialized, like we'd have to look at what are this particular species of fungi that have been known to degrade PFAS, and like how can we encourage them in, for example, hugel systems or other soil systems that we can build. And compost also, because it's high organic matter has the function of binding heavy metals so that they're less available. So there's studies that show, when you grow plants in heavy metals contaminated soil, if you add compost, the plants don't take up as much heavy metals. So you want to use that strategically. Like if you're trying to take up heavy metals, you want those plants to take up the heavy metals and then remove the plants and then put your compost in afterwards so it can bind like whatever's left. And one thing I want to say about hazardous waste, is there's really not a good hazardous waste option available. Hazardous waste sites typically don't take things like contaminated soil or contaminated plants. So then people would just put it in their green bin or the landfill, and that creates more toxic burden on the landfills. And anyway, there's just not really a good solution there. So if you are trying to take out heavy metals, put in plants, there's fungi that can also accumulate. And there's different strategies too. You could use the compost filter sock, kind of dig it into your soil, and then remove that later if you're trying to remove the heavy metals. But yeah, if you're trying to accumulate heavy metals, then you need to remove that material afterwards in order to remove the heavy metals from your site. There's a lot of great research by Prospering Backyards on using a mineral called zeolite to sequester lead, and that's supposed to be a permanent sequestration. The compost is more like maintaining that organic matter in there in order to maintain the sequestration of metals. Biochar is like the burning of wood and biomass, and it turns into like an empty matrix, an empty sponge. So it has all these little pores in it that, you know, microbes and water and nutrients can fill into. So like if you're using it for like plant growth, like your, you know, general farming purposes, you want to inoculate that with compost before you apply it so it can become like a storage solution. But for like contaminant filtration, like it's okay if it's like open because then it's a sponge, it'll absorb everything. So it's good to put that in things like compost filter socks, and also in your sequestration strategy, like it would be good to use biochar. But it also can enhance microbial activity. So if you're trying to push your compost microbes to degrade pHs and contaminants, potentially biochar could also facilitate more microbial activity to do that work. And so, yeah, and fungi can also be accumulating heavy metals and helping to decompose pHs and VOCs and other contaminants. Do you want to talk about the mechanisms?
Sure.
Yeah.
And sort of to give an overview of how this works, right? Like if you think about fungi, right? Fungi aren't just mushrooms. We're talking about molds. We're talking about yeast. We're talking about mycorrhizal fungi. We're talking about cellular fungi. And we're also talking about bacteria, right? And so what's the thing about fungi and bacteria is that they're kind of everywhere on planet Earth, right? So we have them here, we have them on our skin, healthy places, but also we have them in really extreme environments, right? They are growing in like the reactors of Chernobyl, right? They are growing in like, you know, on concrete in sewage treatment plants, and they're also growing in brownfields. So fungi, bacteria, microbes generally have this great adaptability to eat and survive in places that are very extreme. So kind of the principle here is if we look for them there and we work with them, you know, we'll have greater success in dealing with these contaminants. And how plants sort of fit into this as well is that plants are, if you think about it from a microbe or a fungus perspective, plants are sort of like housing for all of these like little creatures, right? Plants provide free sugar, they photosynthesize, they trade that with microbes. So this is how they kind of all work together as one whole. Again, we're talking about how they work sort of in different strategies, but again, this is sort of like the principle of why fungi work, why microbes like that work. So accumulation, which is the method of for heavy metals, is where plants are sucking up heavy metals from the soil into their plant roots and sort of sequestering them. So they're accumulating. Fungi, mushrooms can do this as well, but they're not as good because they're, right, like they grow, they die off, right? Like plants are living there almost all year or like in seasonal cycles. But, right, plants are drawing nutrients from the soil, and that's how these metals are getting in. They're trying to scavenge for things in the soil. They're sometimes even trying to take heavy metals from the soil to protect themselves, right? Like arsenic is like, it can be like a repellent for insects. So that's why the metals are going in there. But we can also work with fungi. Fungi help plants accumulate. So mycorrhizae will actually help native plants to increase that ability, you know, about 1,000 to 10,000. So they'll work in tandem through symbiosis to accumulate, especially lead, arsenic, things like that. But again, we want to really think about when we work with this, we want to, we'll get into this in the next section, you know, what kind of fungi are we working for? We don't necessarily want to, unless we have no other choice, just buy some fungus, right, like that's being sold all across the nation, on a shelf, right? That's not necessarily like a good ecological practice. But that being said, we can work with these to extract metal out of the soil, which is kind of the most difficult process of bioremediation. And then decomposition is another strategy. This is more for those inorganic and organic contaminants, right? Accumulation and stabilization is more for metals because they don't really change. But yeah, decomposition with fungi, they like to break down a lot of them are specialized in breaking down wood, which has this thing called lignin, which is this big structure that actually has these rings of carbon in it. So the same rings of carbon that we have in hydrocarbons, like oil and diesel and PAHs, is the same thing that fungi are, evolutionarily designed fitted to break down. So they'll turn this stuff into food, actually. And that's what we mean when we're saying you'll find them in all these environments. If they're growing on a site that was previously an oil spill or something like that, or even just a waste dump site, you can find fungi. And oftentimes you're finding molds. There's so many different types of molds that are just growing everywhere, even in the Anthropocene. If we're looking at like microplastics in people's houses and in their yards, if you sample any of these, even in the ocean, right, on pieces of plastic, we're finding mold, we're finding bacteria. Wherever they are, they're ultimately trying to eat their environment because that's what they do. They're decomposers. So all we need to do is, in principle, look for that and work with them because that's what they're doing. They're breaking it down. They're turning their environment into food, which is how they exist. Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of details to consider in how these different tools work, and so that's why it's important to understand what's happening on a site so you can kind of like put together a strategy that targets the different contaminants that are present. And these are happening kind of in place, so like we don't necessarily have to dig up the soil. We can create these amendments, apply these inoculants, and do that in place, essentially. And then we'll move things out, like plants or things once they've accumulated all of the heavy metals and things like that. So it's less disruption to kind of utilize these tools. And you had a good idea about post-processing of contaminated plants that I think would be cool to share.
Sure. So there's a question generally, right? Like if we can work with microbes, fungi that just break down, that they digest things, right? We really don't have to worry about, toxic leftovers, right? The fungi will break stuff down, and then there's like almost ecological succession of like contaminants and microbes. Like one microbe will break down a contaminant into like a less toxic thing, and then like a secondary microbe that like eats the other one comes along, and then it breaks down, and it kind of like cascades down. So there's this like actually beautiful process of nature following succession. But with, like Lynn was saying, with plants particularly, right? If we're gonna grow trees, or poplar trees are really good can be really good at accumulating metals, we don't have to think so much about, well, what about the toxic lead, the unchangeable heavy metal that's still in the tree? Well, the tree's gonna last for 100 years, and we've just gotta, best practices might be to keep maintaining that. But if we're looking at other things like sunflowers or some of our, annuals in Southern California, even some of our weeds or, early successional plants, stuff that's not necessarily native but not necessarily invasive, like dandelions and things like that, a lot of these are accumulating a lot of heavy metals. And so the natural question is, well, what do you do with the plants? In one situation, if we kept that system as an ecological, in an ecological cycle and sort of restored it, right, the plants and the living organisms would keep cycling those heavy metals and keeping them sequestered in their processes. But right, like if we're trying to turn a home back into a home, we've got to remove those. And so one thing that fungi can do is for e-waste, there are a lot of Nordic countries that they're making sort of these like filters, or if you imagine like a little screen or just like a panel made of mycelium, and they're grinding up e-waste from like, all across the world, which is like a mix of like gold, nickel, cobalt, all these different things. And the fungi actually act like Velcro for heavy metals. They don't suck it they don't like ingest it into their insides. It just sort of sticks on their skin like a really thorny seed or something like that. And so different fungi will screen for different heavy metals. So they'll have one for cobalt, a fungus that sorbs cobalt, and one that sorbs nickel, and one that sorbs this. And this is how these companies recycle them, is that they get them to attach to these filters, and then you sort of just wash them off with a very simple process, like just an acid or a base wash, and then they're like recollecting heavy metals, or in this case, like precious earth metals for electronics. So that makes them a lot of money, which is why that process exists. But you can do the same thing with fungi for heavy metals, but there's just no money. Nobody's making a lot of money off of like recycling lead or arsenic. But you can do the same thing, and there's been pilot studies. A lot of these studies do exist. They're just sort of in laboratory conditions and trying to figure out ways to ultimately bring the technology to a more DIY accessible state is what a lot of this work is about. So yeah, you can take, let's say, a plant that, like you got a big batch from your site that's accumulated, let's say, a ton of lead, like a bunch of sunflowers and dandelions, let's say, and you can anaerobically digest them, which is just like you put them in water and microbes turn them into a sludge. It's really stinky, but then you can run that sludge across those filters, and then those filters will essentially pull out just the heavy metals. So that's sort of to answer that question. There is that possibility. Kind of the industry standard right now is like incineration or like sacrificial burial, which are like really intense, like burning off carbon and then taking like the heavy metal ash after, and then sort of like handing that off to Department of Toxic Substances, or essentially burying it in like a concrete or like leachable container so that it doesn't leach, or picking like one part of the land to kind of like you put trees in one part of the land, and that's where you're composting all of your heavy metal impacted weeds and perennials and annuals and stuff like that, so that those trees are constantly bringing those up over and over. So it's complicated, but there are different alternatives and paths out there.
One thing I wanted to mention with the compost and microbes and fungi is I think James mentioned commercial strains and stuff like that. So it's important to try to use native species, native microorganisms. I did get to talk to the folks at Co-Renewal, and they've studied extracting native mycorrhizae versus using whole native soil as an inoculum. And inoculum just means there's a substrate with microbes in it, and you put it into a different place, and those microbes are introduced. So you're inoculating those microbes in your new space. So she's compared extracted native mycorrhizae with just whole native soil, and she feels like whole native soil works better in terms of accumulating lead and breaking down pHs. And that makes sense to me because you have your whole microbial ecosystem, you have your whole ecosystem kind of structure in that native soil. And so you have mycorrhizae in there along with other types of microorganisms, which are also going to contribute to pollutant breakdown. Other microbes like actinobacteria or other bacteria also contribute to contaminant breakdown. And they have a way of communicating and working together to, develop stronger mechanisms of breaking down pollutants. So they can kind of learn from each other how to break down these pollutants. So that makes sense to me in terms of the whole soil. So she was suggesting go to a non-fire impacted area and collect some in native soil. There's also ways to try to cultivate that native soil inoculum, so it's not like you want to extract all of the native soil, but you take a little bit for your inoculum, maybe create like a garden bed or raised bed, and fill it with like pretty good soil, and then add your inoculum in there, grow some native plants, and then you're kind of cultivating and proliferating the native microorganisms from that native soil. So that could be your kind of base inoculum. So you could use that in your compost filter stocks, in your bioremediation strategies to introduce those native microorganisms. And it's also good to try to use native fungi. She was mentioning you could get a mycologist to cultivate some native spawn, and it's good to have a diversity of species, not just like focusing everything on oyster. Because you just always run into this concern that this one species everyone is focused on is going to outcompete and dominate other types of species, and you lose your biodiversity that way. So it's like biodiversity is really important. We want to make sure we maintain biodiversity. So other methods that were suggested were like to kind of harvest mushrooms that you see out in native areas, and like make mushroom smoothies or slurries and use that to like inoculate your soil amendments. So anyway, those are some different ideas. You can inoculate like your mature compost with that, along with like native soil. And are we getting into the ethics? Or?
Sure. Yeah. And just to like add on to like Lynn's kind of point there is like there's like for a lot of us, some of us are, maybe some of us aren't plant people, we don't know much about gardening or anything, but we got plant friends, and maybe we're plant people, but we don't know anything about mycology or compost. The whole point is like just like what we're talking about with how these processes all work together to be a holistic treatment of eco-remediation. It's the same thing with like connecting. So like if you as an individual are like, well, damn, I don't know how to find a mushroom or cultivate or do compost or seeds, like connect with, like, this is about connecting with plant people, because plant people know how to do that, and mushroom people know how to do this, and compost people know how to do that. So we've got to form these like communities and groups together, because we can't all like expect it to be this like hologram of knowledge of like every single aspect of all of these. Anyways, so yeah, just I think, do we have one more section after this, or is it questions after this? Oh, community projects. Okay, so I'll quickly go through the just ethics of bioremediation. Harm reduction, right? So prioritizing your own safety, learning about PPE. There can be a lot of people who want to rush straight into this and not think about protecting themselves. It's really like not a great idea, not for like protecting yourself, the sustainability of being able to continue to go out there. These things can make you really sick. So you've got to protect yourself physically, and then also harm reduction in terms of like not introducing unwanted or unintended ecological consequences, right? So if we're using a yellow oyster mushroom because like somebody on the East Coast said like, hey, I use this to like break down oil over here, which is like really cool and awesome, but like that's an invasive mushroom out here. Like we really shouldn't be doing that. Or same thing with different species of plants. Like we should really be prioritizing either native or non-invasive species. So we really want to think about the ecological impact and just harm reduction. And same thing for communities of people, not bringing, right, like, any kind of project, just being mindful of how a project is being presented, how it's working with community, and not necessarily bringing about forces of, gentrification or like, anything like that. That's like, like they got this like sick bioremediation thing and, kind of starts having these unintended consequences. Like you got to stay rooted with the people that are there. If you're not from there, or if you are from there, stay rooted in this way. We just got to think about that. Work with living ecologies. We've kind of been just talking about that, working with what's already on site, what we have available to us in terms of biology, in terms of plants, fungi, microbes, respecting ecological limits, right? So I'm going to push back on a very famous mycologist, which is like, mushrooms can help save the world, right? So that's a lot to put on fungi. That's a lot to put on mushrooms. Ecologies are living finite things. They can't do everything. They are incredible. They are magical. They do things that we like can't imagine ourselves. But at the same time, we need to have respect for how they have limits. If we're just like, let's go throw oyster mushroom spawn, just on like a site out there, like it's not really going to work. It's not magic like that. We've really got to work with them and their limitations, respect for affected communities. So, this is more so for people who are working outside or maybe working in other communities that are affected, which is just, having space and sensitivity for what people are going through, but also like even beyond that, the larger context of history of like maybe like what marginalized communities have been through in that space. Particularly here in Southern California, thinking about the history of colonialism and the history of how we have suppressed indigenous people and tribes here and fire and how that's worked and how that's played into this catastrophe that we're going through. So just respecting that and listening to that. Opposition and to the sources of these damage. So that's one, right? Holding responsible the reasons why these fires happened, what's like, looking at stopping those, taking those down. And then also opposing, being a counter or an alternative to the conventional strategies, the strategies that are gonna keep repeating these cycles, right? Like what could be turned into a long-term movement, right? LA needs, it's the soils, like we've needed our soil worked on for like a long time. Like ever since we like just like blew it like gasoline leaded, dust all over the city. We've really needed this attention. So to build any long-term movement, we need to resist these like quick, again, alternative is more the better word, but these quick profit-driven sort of measures to clean up these cycles. Having alternatives is very important in that sense. Accessible systems. I feel like that's pretty straightforward. Building things that like, it's really cool when somebody has like a lot of money and builds something really sick that like is like in their lab and like cleans up something, but like how are we gonna get that to, the like over like 10,000 structures that burned or people that are affected. So designing systems, building systems that anybody can build. Collaborating ethically, sharing results. Everybody's got their own stuff, like we're all trying to make a buck in this world, but we've got to collaborate, especially in a crisis like this, so finding a sustainable way to share your results, work with others. Lynn mentioned this one, whole ecologies over panaceas, so, like, let's not be like, mushrooms are the one thing that has to go on these sites, or like, it's like sunflowers everywhere. Like, it's a whole system. Like, I love when somebody's super enthusiastic about one thing, but like, let's fold that enthusiasm into like a larger context, rather than sort of being like, I've got the solution, I've got the magic card. Approaches over solutions, which is just simple, like, we're working towards this. We don't have any, like, we're not trying to have this position of having all the answers, of being heroes. We don't need heroism or saviorism in this sort of space or in this project. It's already very difficult work no matter what. So it's just, it's an approach. It's not a solution necessarily. And then the last one is, Lynn already mentioned, test. Is that it's totally fine for you to, if you've read somewhere or heard from somebody about some cool bioremediation plant or technique that you should work on, and let's say like you really like that plant, or you love buckwheat or whatever, and you want to like plant it everywhere, and like, but unless you're testing, both for your own safety, right? If you're just planting buckwheat and not testing, and you're not looking at what's actually changed, and you're thinking that's bioremediation or just saying that's bioremediation, it's kind of dangerous to yourself, right? Like, you really don't know if anything's changed. It'd be great. Like, I believe in buckwheat, but we've got to know. So, and it also, it's not only potentially harmful to you, it's also possibly harmful to the field in general, to other people that are trying to, right, a lot of this work is convincing, bringing the governance, the agencies to the table and making them take these seriously. And so when we have situations where somebody's just scattering seeds and not testing and saying it's bioremediation, and the federal government comes back and we says, like, you know, we gave you all this money to do this, but nothing has changed. Like, bioremediation doesn't work. It's a really bad consequence. So test, even, you know, that's a hard thing in terms of accessibility. I already acknowledged that, but we can find a way. There's resources that are coming. There's infrastructure that people are trying to build. Like, there's mutual aid that we can find. Yeah.
Thank you for putting that together. One thing I want to mention before just introducing some of the community projects is another kind of conventional remediation technique, which is like to just like bring in clean soil, like, I don't know, like a foot or something, and just putting that on top of contaminated soil and like acting like a clean cap. One thing I was thinking about was like creating like a biological cap. So clean soil, yes, but also like compost, biochar, fungi, and maybe doing some kind of like hugel kind of layer with like logs and branches and things like that in it, to also continue to cultivate beneficial microbes and letting that kind of stabilize the contaminants underneath. Anyway, just wanted to share that idea. And yeah, we're gonna just finish up here with the community projects that we mentioned. We have links to Co-Renewal, CARE, Center for Applied Ecological Remediation, Soilwise, and there's a group called Mycelium Matters, which has been really kind of taking initiative to try to bring in some bioremediation work and get native fungi out there. And we also are aware of Christine Hinkle from 301 Organics, who's working hard to spread like lots of compost and mulch everywhere, which is great. And also and then there's the follow-up and Q&A. So I also just want to invite, like we don't know everything. This is like what we know and we want to share, and we want to start this conversation. So if you have an answer to a question that we have, or if you have additional knowledge or ideas, please share that in the survey so we can just, you know, build our collective knowledge and collective capacity together. So thank you so much. We're going to transition into Q&A for the last portion. So yeah, if you have specific questions, you could just raise your hand, and I'm going to be repeating the questions for the video. Yeah. Yeah. A hiking trail? Okay, so the question was to test a hiking trail. I would probably first try to talk to like the entity that's like caring for the trail, and just, you know, make sure that they're on board, and you know, that you could share the results with them and see like if you could just do it yourself, or they potentially could have funding to do it with you. That would be my suggestion. And I don't know if you guys have other thoughts about that. I don't know if Miriam has thought about that.
Oh, sorry.
Just like, I don't know, like if somebody came to the Arlington and just took a soil sample without telling you about it, or.
I mean, if that happened, I mean, we actually thought that had happened because there was a test done at Pasadena and Arlington, but it turned out it was the school across the street. And I mean, I don't know, we'd really have to ask Tahre, but I mean, if something like that happened and people were willing to pay for it for themselves, like, please just let us know. Like, I think a really great thing is that, and I've had to walk away a couple times, but I don't know if you talked about how people are sharing all of their soil test information through that form, of all the Eaton sites, and I just think that that's so fascinating to look at, and so, I mean, that's sort of my. It's there's like a survey out there. I mean, maybe you have a link to it, or you can share it, or you know.
Yeah, I didn't include the link in the notes doc, but there is a link, like somebody put together a Google form to collect soil testing results that they're putting into like a public database. But yeah, if you wanted to test, like, it depends on like who's running the hiking trail. So it's always a good idea to just check in with like whoever's kind of like in charge. back there.
Yeah, you just mentioned the collection of data. I'm connected to several kind of micro community groups. We have a standing house in the middle of burn zone, and people are sharing their data. There's already one spreadsheet up there with about 2 dozen results, for example. I think finding a way to coordinate all those and get them more centralized, but it's already going on at a micro level.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. That, just for those who couldn't hear, just saying that RE part of a group that's collecting data, and that we need to find a way to centralize all this. So please, like, if you got the handout, there's a form, follow up with us so that we can stay in touch and, again, just like build a coalition to share data and connect people. Warm hat.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about asbestos testing and interpreting test results, because I'm a gardener, and so I spend a lot of time in the soil. And so I actually found a lab, like Pinnacle Labs, that I could drive soil samples to, and they could give me the heavy metal results. But they cannot help me, like the information they can give me about asbestos, I won't be able to interpret. And apparently you have to be like certified or something to interpret asbestos results. And I'm like, I kind of want to know for my own safety, like, is there like a cheaper way than paying like some certified person $1,000 per test?
Yeah, I'll let Lynn answer this one, but the question was about asbestos testing, working in the garden, being exposed to potentially asbestos, and hearing that it's difficult to interpret, that labs won't interpret what those results mean, that you maybe then have to hire an expert after that, which is another really expensive charge. So the question was, are there alternatives to that? How can we empower ourselves to interpret those results?
Yeah, thank you for that question. From my understanding, like the quotes that I got from contaminant testing labs, there was like a bulk, they call it PLM, like polarized light microscopy. I think they just look at it under this microscope to see if it's there or not, and that's like a qualitative. That was very inexpensive. It's like $15, and I'm still not exactly sure what results they're going to give me, if it's just like yes or no, like there's asbestos or not. And then there was like a more expensive test they gave me, which was $200, and I think that's maybe more quantitative. So I'm also still learning this, so I would probably be like consulting with an environmental engineer or like somebody like Danielle to help me understand like how to interpret those results if I wanted to go to that next level of like the quantitative analysis. So right now we've just been sending in samples for the qualitative, like the yes or no. Yeah.
Can I just say, make a note? And yeah, this might be like a frustrating answer, but I like one of the things that like, you know, Lynn and I are acutely aware of, and so is, you know, CARE and other organizations, is this gap. And so rather than trying to continue the cycle of like, oh yes, like please pay me $1,000 and I'll explain this to you, which is like I get it, like for big jobs, like that's what you deserve for your engineering work, but like ultimately, like we need like workforce development, training programs that are available that help. This is like the long-term strategy, is like to empower people to understand their results. So that is a thing like lots of people are trying to actively build towards, is making this much more accessible. So hopefully maybe like Lynn or I or somebody will figure out how to, you know, with the help of others, how to interpret it and maybe make a cool little FAQ or something. I don't know. Can't make any promises.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, like I know like Kara, like we all want to make this information like more accessible. Like, you know, we're filming this and putting this on YouTube, and like I don't know. Hopefully, like if we have all the information, like we can put together some kind of like toolkit, infographic, or like a YouTube video about how to understand, interpret like some of these results and like what they mean. So that's definitely something that we want to create. In the back. Okay.
All right, so my question is, sorry if I'm shouting, primarily concerning public spaces, schools, and parks. My daughter's school just got relocated to a campus that's like within a mile of the burn zone. So a lot of parents are concerned. There's only so much we can do in terms of like the board board doesn't want to test for like externally for heavy metals and things like that, so we're still figuring that out. What we were told by the superintendent to do was to saturate the soil and allow the contaminants to sink. To me, that sounds like, I don't know if in the interim that's helpful. Can you guys speak to that at all?
I mean, this is like a classic. Oh, excuse me. The question was, the preface was that your children were relocated to a site that was, within a mile of a burn zone. A lot of parents are worried about the contamination on site. The school is refusing to do testing. Excuse me. The board, excuse me. The board is refusing to do testing, and the superintendent's advice or reassurance was that they were going to heavily water the areas, and that would be sufficient to protect people. So this is like an old adage in like environmental cleanup, which is like the solution to pollution is dilution, which is just like an absolute terrible, it works, but it's not like, where does it go? So it depends question, right? That depends on the nature of, I mean, this is why testing is important. Some stuff, yeah, will leach into the ground, and that's a whole nother issue that's like not great long term, but like if we've got to think short term and harm reduction, but other things will not. Other things might off gas, other things might stay in the soil. It also depends on the kind of soil, like really clay heavy soil, one doesn't drain well, but also holds on to a lot of these like minerals. Sandy soils might drain super fast. So, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that that's the question. I might make the suggestion of trying to pool resources to get one test and sort of like guerrilla style it. And once you have a test in hand, like a lot of this is like demanding accountability, demanding safety. A lot of this stuff is invisible. It's arcane and really like labyrinthian to people to figure out what any of this stuff is, the science behind it. So it's really important to bring these things to light and to talk about them. And so definitely I would say, like, if you're feeling an itch to test, you should test.
Thank you.
Do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I would also recommend pooling resources to try to do some testing. And in terms of like where, because they're expensive, like where to prioritize that testing, I would prioritize it in like high traffic areas where people are gathering or walking through, or in kind of food producing areas where people are working with soil or plants like very closely. So, if you are limited in what you can test for, those are the areas that I would prioritize. And you can take a representative sample, so you can take little scoops from all different areas. I have really just been testing like the top 3 inches or so of soil, and so I'm just using my like hori knife trowel. You could just use that. I also did get like a small soil probe, which can get like a little bit more depth in there. So anyway, that would be my recommendation. So.
I have a question. You mentioned something about prospering backyards and zeolite. What's zeolite?
The question was about prospering backyards and zeolite. So they're a really cool organization. They've been doing work in South LA to remediate lead in residential soils in South LA. And they've been testing compost and zeolite. Zeolite is a mineral, so it's supposed to sequester lead like permanently. And so it's like there was already like lead contamination in different communities around here. And so people have already been working on solutions to those challenges. So it's great to be able to draw from that experience.
Yeah, and it's a non-extractive mineral tool, which is cool in that regard. But there should be a point made that they brought up themselves, is that if you're trying to do bioremediation or extraction of heavy metals out of soil with plants, you should not do them at the same time. So what zeolites are doing, like we talked about, is like sequestration. Like Lynn was saying, they're like these like little rocks with like a bunch of tubes in them, and the lead moves into the tiny tube and gets stuck there. So that's like sequestering it. But if we are, really wanting to remove that out of the soil, the lead or the heavy metals, we want to work with plants and fungi and other things first, and then let's say maybe after we're like, we've done that and we've like spent resources and time or a year doing phyto extraction, myco extraction, then we would like apply zeolites at the end to be like, like, all right, we're gonna throw this in for like any residual that we're just having a hard time getting out. We're gonna make like a sort of like a buffer clean zone out of zeolites, which is like basically like a silica-based thing. So in terms of like how it's affecting your soil, there's not too much concern if you're like a gardener or just like breathing it in and stuff like that. Other questions? Did you have your hand up? Yeah. No, you.
Yeah. Kind of two questions. The first question is about that plant removal process, and say you do plant something that removes it or brings it up out of the soil. Is it in the plants? Is it usually removed?
Yeah.
From
This is a good question. So the question is, if when you're doing plant removal, phyto myco extraction, where the plant's pulling out heavy metals, like where is it going? Like, oh, I'm gonna wait for this helicopter to pass. So in certain cases, I think like we want to remove them if that's our target, right? Like it's a good idea to remove it if it's like you're growing, if that's the intention, right? You're growing dandelions or something, some kind of annual, you're removing them for that reason. If you're worried about more like your fruit trees long term, or if you're talking about like garden stuff, what I found, I have like worked on testing like over 100 plants, different kinds of plants, for heavy metals in their tissues. So what I was doing was taking the plants, dividing them into their roots, the stalks, the leaves, and then the fruit ultimately. What you find most of the time, especially the larger the organism, right? So as we get towards trees, most of that is kept in the roots. And that's kind of the case across all the plants, is that they're keeping the heavy metals and stuff like that in the roots. It's their defense mechanism, like if it gets up into their seeds and into their fruit and their reproductive systems, right, that's like damaging them like for like the rest of their generation. So that's like the top priority for them. So some other plants, maybe in like really toxic environments, you're finding like a little bit of other things. Like I've seen aluminum collect like very heavily in some beans. But for the most part, it's like, I want to say like 90% in the roots in terms of heavy metals. I know it's a bit different with herbs and like grassy, leafy stuff. Lynn, do you want to?
Yeah, so some plants will like accumulate it up into their shoots and leaves and things like that. So it depends on the plant type. So it just depends on the site that you're working with. Yeah.
Did you want to talk about like ash on like concern of like,
Oh yeah.
like on stuff that's landed on the outside?
Which plants are good for which like?
Wait, what was the question?
Let me just respond to the ash question first. So about like removing ash from plants. So, and like this has been a common question of like what to do with my vegetable produce, and like washing it really well. But honestly, like if it's like a lettuce or a cabbage, like I would remove like the outer leaves, and then I would probably just remove remove the outer leaves, and then wash like all of the leaves, like kind of break it apart, not as like a whole head, and wash it several times. You could also do the like 10% vinegar solution to like really remove the soil like particles and contaminants. And I mean, like it depends. Like you kind of have to make your own judgment in terms of like what you're comfortable with. But that would be a way to be able to like wash and still eat that produce. Roots tend to accumulate more metals and contaminants. So like daikon radish or carrots or things like that, those are gonna accumulate like more metals and contaminants in that part where you're eating it. So potentially like you may not want to eat those, or it's a good idea to peel the skin off of those types of foods if you still want to eat them. Fruits are less likely to accumulate contaminants from the soil and metals from the soil, some of like fruit trees. In terms of like I feel like thin-skinned fruits, potentially if there's like ash on them, could absorb some of the contaminants. So you could like peel it or like remove those fruits. Like thick-skinned fruits are probably going to be safer to consume. So these are all ideas, and like it's kind of up to your own judgment in terms of like what you're comfortable with. And then, what was your question?
Well, you said, it depends on which plants, what they do. How do we find out which plants to work?
Do you have good insight on that?
So it really, again, it depends, unfortunately, but looking up, there are species of plants that are known to be hyperaccumulators, right? For us to create a comprehensive list is like quite difficult. I oftentimes am trying to like source scientific literature to figure this out. I use Sci-Hub, which is like a way to get past a paywall. So if you can use that helps you, just basically looking up, if you're worried about corn, look up corn, metal accumulation, and try to, if you read the abstract and you read the conclusion, and you can basically find out what they're saying about that. But it's essentially how people have mapped what plants are accumulating what. If you have the resources, you can test it yourself. You can send in plant tissue samples, but again, that can be quite expensive. Yeah.
I have a recommendation on a book you can read called Earth Repair by Leela Darwish, and it kind of just goes into like bioremediation and like getting together as a community and like along the plants that you can use.
Yara's recommending Earth Repair by Lila Darwish,
Yeah, Darwish? Yeah.
I think. Yes. In the back.
I have a statement to make. Number one, we have a lot of recommendation and guidelines to follow as looking at Santa Rosa, looking at Paradise. But there is not a written guideline or a policy in place. We are doing the groundwork right now, looking at the testing. But if we have something like this and evolve that to a policy, because unfortunately we know the urban fire is going to continue on, but there is all recommendation, whether it's public health, whether it's FEMA doubling down on things. But if we have that policy in place at the local or state level, so how can we just all, the way we are talking here, say testing. If we put it in a guideline, I know it would be much easier to approach the officials and say, you better do it, it's in our policy. So what are the work you think or envision that's going to happen in terms of policy?
So the question is, what kind of policy are we hoping for, or? It's a great question. I don't know if I could answer it all. Again, I'm gonna like double down on, one is testing infrastructure. Again, like the Army Corps of Engineers refusing to test or not having accessible infrastructure to test is one huge thing. Again, like knowledge is power in the sense of like, if we have a problem, like we need to know that we have a problem, and to solve that or approach that problem, we have to have knowledge of the nature of it. So that's one. I don't know. It's a great question. I don't think I'm like completely prepared to articulate it. But yeah, testing, more workforce development on how training people and how to respond to these. Like right now, if you wanted somebody to bioremediate, you're basically having to look at local coalitions, which is great, and I think that that's important, but it's also a very heavy burden on people who are already burdened. But yeah, I would like to see a future where testing is free, if not extremely accessible. I'd like to see a future where there is government money or funding for people to connect with organizations that either help them where they need help or train them to do this themselves. And then also to be a network hub. That's sort of the policy that's the triage policy, right? That's like after the fact of what we've gone through. I think I'd also like to see other policies in terms of, in remediation, right? It's both addressing the end of the sort of leaking faucet where all of like everything is going and dripping and cleaning it up there, but also we need to stop the faucet from leaking. which is, perhaps the materials that we build with, the way that we manage fires, et cetera, et cetera. That's also policy that I'd like to see to prevent this. Yeah.
Yeah, I know there's like a lot of different groups who are doing testing and data aggregation. I just saw an article about how there's several universities working on a kind of long-term public health study, like studying like taking air and soil samples from different types of locations and tracking like people's health in the aftermath of this wildfire. That type of data, the kind of Caltech and UC Davis initiatives, our community kind of testing initiatives. It would be great to look at all of that data and do some kind of a synthesis with that to be able to develop like a policy recommendation. Like I feel like we need that data, like even looking at the distribution of contaminants across like LA County, it would be great to develop something like that in order to understand like, hey, this is what happened, if it's like the wind blew it south or to the ocean, and this is the source, like we're building with all this toxic stuff, there's PFAS and everything, like can we stop doing that? Can we use something better? Can we have more fireproof buildings? Can we use more like earthen materials and not use all this crazy like toxic stuff in our manufacturing and building products? So I think that's kind of it's gonna take time to develop that in order to kind of collect all of the evidence and data to inform that policy.
Let me ask, for someone who owns a property in Pasadena that burned in 2025, is bioremediation like a full alternative now to, let's say, removing soil and doing traditional remediation?
Yeah, so the question was if somebody has a burned down home in Altadena, is bioremediation an option for them now? You probably have the option of, you're probably gonna have to do debris removal first. So if it's the Army Corps that's doing debris removal, they're gonna remove like the top 6 inches of soil, like a hazardous, or a company might be doing something similar. So it's like once the debris is removed, like you could do bioremediation on your soil. Like you could do contaminant testing and you could come up with like a bioremediation strategy. And that would be a really great case study to look at how well did these amendments and practices work in cleaning up the contaminants in that soil.
So let me just follow up. People can opt out of that program and not have the Army Corps of Engineers remove soil. Is that a viable option, do you think, to opt out of that if there's bioremediation?
That's a good question. If you were gonna leave all the debris on the site, like I would want to create like a pretty thick kind of cap over that, like biological cap, the one that kind of mentioned, and I don't know, it could kind of take time for things to really break down in that process.
So I'll kind of answer this in like twofold. One is the EPA is like still on the fence about, they're very much on board with bioremediation of like oil and organic contaminants. Heavy metals is something they're not completely convinced by, which is why some recent research is actually quite hopeful in rebutting that. Their whole point was that this has been done in like, they have this one study that they did in like pots in a green like house, and they were like, it didn't work. And then, so there's been studies since, especially in Southern California, about it working in the field, which is very, very important. So whether or not they would accept that as a legal soil remediation plan, soil management plan is tough. The CARE has been talking with some of the Army Corps and some other officials on soil, and they are going to let us do some testing and some treatment on sites, collection sites after. So there are some inches to manipulate into maybe bigger gaps there. And then in terms of your just straightforward question, if you didn't, could bioremediation work regardless of whether you're legally allowed or not to? I think, again, it depends on what's there. Sometimes there are contaminants that are extremely difficult to remove, and that might inform, like, hey, we actually might want to cap or might want to remove maybe not the full 3 inches or something like that. And again, even if we're talking about soil removal, we're still talking about trying to push for bioremediation of that soil, the removed soil itself, not just dumping it somewhere and letting it still be toxic. But definitely, I mean, so if you look at some of the studies on brownfields, you're looking at, like, you know, kind of horrendous numbers, you know, in terms of lead, in terms of petroleum, like in the thousands of parts per million. And you're definitely able to see like a serious reduction of contaminants, and these are like now finally being considered as alternatives for some of the government's Superfund sites. So it's definitely possible. There's definitely a possibility of bioremediation, yes.
Oh, one thing I wanted to add was, like, I think it, like, there are cases where you may want to remove the soil, like the top couple of inches, if there's really like bad stuff in there. It would be great if that was maybe taken to like a local brownfield site and, you know, like putting a biological cap or doing bioremediation like on that site. It would be great if that was something that was supported by an entity like LA Sanitation or something, so it could be like properly monitored and maintained. I feel like that's an idea that could be better than like trucking it out to a different state.
I had a kind of follow-up question to one of the other people that asked. Say you're planting something like a sunflower. You know your property, you have one small little lot. You know your property has 150 parts per million of lead, and you're planting sunflower seeds. What do you do with that sunflower plant afterwards? A lot of times people don't tell you, well, what do you do? It's good to plant the sunflower to get the lead uptake, but I have never heard a clear answer what to do with the plant.
So the question is, like, you put in sunflowers to remove lead, so what do you do with it afterwards? And yeah, there is no real good solution. There's not a real like hazardous waste option for that to go to. People end up putting it in their landfill. The idea that James shared to create like an anaerobic digester and putting that contaminated plant material in there reduces the metals into a sludge, so you have a smaller volume of contaminated material to deal with. One option is to pay like a hazardous waste company to like pick that up. And that's probably going to go to incineration. Yeah.
Yeah, just to piggy off Lynn, yeah, there's not really a great solution in terms of this. Like, one, I think it's still important to celebrate the fact that plants are able to, that we've pulled the lead out of the soil, which is like, right, we don't know where it is in the soil, we don't know when we're breathing it and not. When we've successfully removed it, that's one step, but in this process, still we're in like a world of precarity. So I guess I would add, reducing it to a sludge. Some people suggest just putting it in a container where it composts, and it stays in that container. Another option is having like a sacrificial area where you're let's say you're composting those sunflowers like next to a tree that's going to hold those metals for, you know, however long the tree lives. I am more inclined personally, and again, situations change and I would change my mind depending on the situation, but personally to trying to remove it from the site, not letting it get back in. It's such hard. Lead is, for example, not naturally occurring. It's the naturally occurring amount of lead is 0 ppm. It's everything we've done with gasoline and leaded paint and leaded products that has put it at such a high level. So I would consider sequestering it in something, a container, and then trying to communicate with Department of Toxic Substances if you can hand that off to them or pay somebody to take it. You want to answer this one? The question was, is there, going off of what do you do with potentially contaminated plant material, is it better to put it in the black bin or is it better to put it in the green bin? The worry being that putting it in the green bin means that it might go back into the city's composting system if they have one.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. You know, the green bin is going to come back as compost. People are going to use it in their gardens. So, I don't know. Like I said, there's not a good solution. If you really want to, you know, make sure it doesn't come back, but it's going to end up in like a landfill community. So, I don't know. That would be like, I would say, you know, you would have to, you just make that choice, I guess. Like, it's going to go into a landfill. That's going to impact the community around the landfill. It's going to go into compost. Like, people are going to get that compost back in various sites. So potentially it's better for it to be in the landfill community. It's not really like an ideal answer either way.
Again, not going to give an answer, just like, I think what does help is just like the principle of harm reduction, is thinking about like, how are we reducing harm in an ethical way? Yeah, it's a really tough choice. Other questions? Oh, Rob?
Something that just occurred to me was that I wonder if you combine the anaerobic sludge solution with the zeolites and just dump a bunch of zeolites into the sludge. You can just toss the zeolites.
That's a great suggestion. He's saying if you reduce the plant material into a sludge, and just so for those that might not be familiar with that, like if you just put plants in water and just let it sit for a really long time, it gets really anaerobic and stinky, and that's the microbes breaking down the plants and generating all these like funky smells. But it makes a sludge, and then the suggestion was like, actually, what if you mix that sludge with zeolites, and you know, then it's kind of like you're sequestering the lead at that point. And again, zeolites are the mineral that can sequester lead. Yeah.
So then you've made your decision that goes to the landfill.
I guess, well, not necessarily. I mean, you could keep that jar or that bucket and be, you know, still keep it in like a bin, and, you know, the worry always about a container is that containers leak, right? So, but if you had a container that you put all this stuff in and you put zeolites in, and maybe you put zeolites around the container, even if there was a leak, the leak would be, you've already sort of like double, triple layered protection, and you're keeping it near you rather than necessarily dumping off. Or if you send it to the landfill, it's zeolite sequestered. Or if you send it to compost, it's zeolite sequestered. So that's actually a very interesting suggestion. I think she's letting you. Yeah.
I guess I have a question. I work with very young children outdoors, and we're inside right now because I was terrified. I don't want to cause any harm to them. We had some soil testing done among some of the areas that we go, and I haven't actually read through pages, but we haven't done the pHs there, but I'm just really like, I'm really worried. I don't want to cause harm to them, and we are like about 5 to 6 miles. You know, little kids touch the ground, they eat stuff, so they do all these things. I mean, I don't know. I'm just really curious. Want to know if you have any suggestions or concerns. Is it still safe for me to take them out?
Sure. So the question was, or the situation was, working with a lot of young children at a school, and just being concerned about their safety, right? Children love to touch dirt, put it in their mouths, breathe it in, kicking it up. And just if there's any tips or suggestions on safety, whether, you know, we should keeping them inside or what can be done.
Yeah, that's a good question. I I think it would be good to like talk to the kids about what's happening and help them be aware that maybe we don't know like the level of contamination around. And unfortunately, I heard they don't even make like N95 masks for kids. But if there is some like safety gear, like gloves or something, or I don't know, like it seems like somebody should make a mask for kids. I guess teaching them about protective equipment would be good too, and maybe teaching them a little bit about like bioremediation. You know, maybe going to sites where there's like more organic matter, or like sites that are like further out from the fires, or like that's like a farm that's like spreading a lot of compost around, might be like a safer option. So yeah, I would say just education and trying to choose like safer spots for them to go to, and yeah.
Yeah, I think also, yeah, mulching the area. I'd be curious to know what the area looks like, but mulching, like Lynn was saying, is a good idea. I think, yeah, I feel like I'm not a teacher of small children, but I think like, you know, teaching them in a way that's like, you know, maybe making a game out of it, of like, you know, like they're, I don't want to, like, you know, teaching them what's really going on, but also like, you know, like the soil is lava or something like that. Like, you know, like, and like really, like, it would be really beneficial to teach, I mean, this is, like, we live in LA. It would really be beneficial to teach kids just like rituals that they get for the rest of their lives of how you approach soil. It's like, we should be having gloves on, like, you know, we should be wearing like a bandana, and like, you know, like, or like if you can get a mask, that's great. Like, you know, we should be washing like underneath our fingernails, like teaching those rituals. I think, one, those are things that protect you. Gloves and masks, it's the same thing. Not putting it in your mouth, not, you know, making sure you're washing your hands. I think that's a great opportunity to teach them something that protects them now and for the rest of their life. And like trying to teach, I'd be really curious to try to figure out how to teach that concept of like, there's an invisible thing in the soil that we like, you know, not to make people, you got to find the line and not make them fear soil, but at the same time to be protective. I think there's something rich there to potentially look into. I don't know. That's the, yeah. Yeah. True. Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, I also think like being outside is like, again, considering like, right, if it's very windy and it's very dry, if we have dust, like we can't control necessarily where we are, like you're saying, even if we've cleaned up the schoolyard or wherever we are, if we're doing a field trip. And I think, again, just practicing PPE, like in those cases, I know the barefoot thing is like quite difficult, and so is like the rolling around in the dirt, in the soil. I think like, again, I just think there are cases like you can have really toxic soil. You will probably know by like the lack of like anything growing around there, but like you have stuff that will definitely, right, like harm or cause irritation on skin contact. Most of like what has spread wide and far, especially on trails, even through like just how lead has spread across the city, that necessarily won't damage you just through skin contact. Usually with lead, it's like skin contact, or getting it on somewhere and then breathing that dust in, bringing that into places where you're touching it, and then putting it in your mouth or breathing it again. So again, I think like rituals of cleaning and stuff like that are really important in addressing that. Did you have more? Or? Okay. Okay. Any other questions?
I just want to point a couple things out. I have these decontamination wipes here. They were created like for firefighters that are getting exposed to these materials. it's called D-Wipe, and I got it from a site called Rescue Tech. So if you're going to burn sites, it's good to get all covered up, have your respirator, and once you've taken everything off, kind of wipe. This is for skin. They also make some for your equipment, so I'm always wiping down my tools that I've used out in the field. This is a spray bottle with soapy water. I added this stuff called Bonami. It's like a natural mineral for scrubbing abrasive action. So I'm like rinsing off my tools and gloves and everything with that, and then washing afterwards too. When you're trying to decontaminate your tools, you need like a detergent to move all of the contaminants off of that surface. Antimicrobials could be good, but that's not necessarily like the specific kind of mechanism that we're going for. So anyway, I just wanted to share if you wanted to check this out or get your own decontamination wipes, that's something that I found. But if there's no more questions, thank you so much for your time.
Just say, thank you. And again, if you have questions or if you think of questions, anything like that, just use the follow-up form. Use it if you just want to stay in touch, if you want to be put in connection with other people. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you everyone so much for coming. Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, James. Sorry, sometimes my brain is like, ugh, after a while. But thank you so much for coming and sharing knowledge. Somebody actually caught me on the way out and said they really wanted to thank you personally as well, but they had to leave. But thank you so much for coming, sharing all this great information, and like also compiling this amazing resource document and list. I did want to just share with everyone, we do have some other programs coming up. The one next month that's going to be also co-organized with Lynn. Because we did a quick kind of pivot on this series, we're going to do something else, and then we're like, wait a second. So we need to talk about what's happening now. And so we're going to be doing something that's going to be more for, it's for all ages, but also for, super appropriate for super young kids too. So we're going to be doing like seed balls, bioremediation seed balls, and there's going to be other activities coming up. So that's going to be March 15th. So all these programs that we're coming on the third Saturday of the month, 2 to 4 time. So please come out again, let people know. We also have lots of other things going on. I think everybody signed up on the email list. So thank you so much for coming. Yeah.